Chinese people have been going overseas to Africa for more than 30 years, and many overseas Chinese and companies have taken root there. But many people actually don't know much about this land, which is regarded as an emerging overseas market. From the first batch of domestic overseas travelers brought by early support, to the African fever brought about by the trend of Chinese-funded enterprises going overseas, to many overseas entrepreneurs with entrepreneurial ideas who gradually jumped out from the big platforms and completed their careers locally. With its transformation, Africa is truly a dream continent that has been ignored for a long time. Africa itself is also developing at a speed beyond our imagination. From the initial distrust of Chinese brands by local residents, to the great recognition of Made in China by Africans, Chinese mobile phones such as Huawei and Transsion have been accepted, and Chinese brands have also experienced from small to large, from agglomeration to dispersion, the journey from being suspected to being trusted. Which markets in Africa are still blue oceans? How do people who establish businesses in Africa overcome the huge cultural and employment differences with the locals? When they went to Africa, what did they rely on to find gold? Zai Guanqi chatted with several Chinese people who went to Africa at different stages and listened to their stories about their experiences and the African market in their eyes. African local environment. Source, interviewee. Taking advantage of the local east wind, the Chinese are mining gold in Africa. In the 1960s, many workers sent by domestic provinces for construction assistance projects traveled thousands of miles to Africa and began to build local infrastructure such as power stations and dams. After the reform and opening up, bold people from China's southeastern coast came here in batches with domestic products and became overseas Chinese businessmen who started business and registered in Africa. Some of them choose to stay in Africa and become self-employed in the trade. Some purchased some small commodities and daily necessities from home and transported them by sea to Africa, where they became the first Chinese shopkeepers. Others opened local Chinese restaurants and brought the flavor of Chinese cuisine to Africa. Distant overseas markets in Africa. Source, interviewee. At that time, the circle of Chinese overseas travelers in Africa was very small. When I met a few Chinese passengers on a local flight, I often found that everyone knew each other. Du Rui, who is now the Secretary General of an African Chamber of Commerce, told Xinhua News. Since 2006, Du Rui and his husband have come to Zimbabwe, a country in southern Africa. From the initial stage of entrepreneurship to today, the industries they are engaged in include building materials, mining, real estate, and industrial park development in Africa. The number of local employees in the company is close to 400. Most of the initial individuals who went overseas in Africa were concentrated in the two fields of small commodity trading and catering. But after 2010, changes have been gradually taking place. The Chinese business in Africa has transformed from trade at the beginning to manufacturing, that is, doing business locally, setting up factories locally, and employing local people to process products. It has gone beyond the scope of simple commodity transactions. I still remember that in 2018, we invested about 40 million yuan in upgrading the entire industry. Du Rui said. From 2009 to 2015, with the rapid economic growth of Zimbabwe for 6 years, Mr. Du Rui also caught the east wind of local development and accumulated the foundation for the early stage of his career. As the political situation in Zimbabwe gradually stabilized in 2017, a large number of project investments in industrial parks, real estate, and upstream and downstream building materials began to gradually come online. Another Chinese manufacturer that opened a mineral water company in Zimbabwe also felt the same way. This mineral water brand has a very impressive market share in Africa, and it is also the drinking water for Air Zimbabwe's aircraft. This mineral water company manufactures and promotes its own brand locally. Mineral water brand ZLG. Source, interviewee. Naturally, water resources are sourced locally in Africa, and after they expanded in scale, they gradually had their own supporting packaging factories. For example, a large part of the polyethylene particles needed for mineral water plastic bottle caps are from domestic procurement of raw materials, also promotes overseas trade between both parties. In the later stages, the investment of Chinese overseas investors in Africa has expanded to investment in local land, which is what we call spending money to buy land in Africa. Land in Africa is privately owned, and a lot of land is listed for sale on the market, and transactions can be concluded through intermediaries. Of course, they also distinguish between commercial land and residential land, etc. When purchasing, The buyer will also conduct a land background investigation and qualification review through a lawyer, but in the final analysis, the land reserve reached through purchase and sale is a pure form of land use in Africa. Commercial activity. Many people who decide to buy land in Africa, on the one hand, are attracted by the local investment transaction method, that is, land payment. On the other hand, they also feel that spending money to buy land locally is very cost-effective. Even in the capitals of some small African countries, land prices are not high. 1 acre, approximately equal to more than 4,000 square meters, of land only costs less than 500,000 US dollars, approximately more than 3.6 million yuan. I have seen many Chinese companies buy 7,000 acres of land at one time in a certain African country. An old overseas traveler who has lived in Africa for nearly 10 years told Zite One News, the Chinese are buying local land and building industrial parks to attract investment. This is nothing new. Chinese goods occupy Africa. Zhao Xian, who was dispatched to the African market by a large state-owned enterprise in 2013, told Zite One News, in fact, before influential Chinese brands really entered Africa, Africans were very suspicious of Chinese manufacturing. They once thought that what we produced was counterfeit goods. Due to the entry of some off-brand and low-end products into Africa at the end of the last century, domestic products have a poor reputation, creating many artificial difficulties for many large domestic brand companies to enter the local market. After 2010, more and more Chinese private companies have sent more employees to Africa. Domestic brands such as home appliances and mobile phones, such as TCL, he says, Midea, and Huawei, as well as Gree, Konka and other exports to Africa have also reached a small climax in this decade. A large number of cost-effective Chinese products have entered the African market, and local people's attitude towards made in China has also greatly changed. As Chinese brands occupy the African market, the consumer base of overseas brands that originally had a high market share in Africa has repeatedly shrunk. After Chinese brands went overseas in 2010, it had a certain impact on Samsung, LG, and other brands that originally occupied the African market in the home appliance category. Originally, their market share in Africa was about 80%, but now it has dropped to only 10%. Su Ran, the founder of Muoc, the African home appliance brand, told Zite One News. He also set foot on the African continent just in time for the going overseas craze in the past 10 years. At that time, a large number of Chinese brands took root in Africa and were the pioneers of African overseas entrepreneurship. At that time, it was even more popular for Chinese brands to go overseas than it is now. Su Ran said, when Chinese home appliance companies went overseas, they invested real money overseas. They first went to Southeast Asia and Europe, and when they reached Africa, they were almost the last stop. On the one hand, what the locals value when buying things is the price-performance ratio of the product. When you don't have enough money in your pocket, you will definitely consider the price-performance ratio when buying things. On the other hand, the after-sales policy and quality assurance of large-ticket items, for local Africans crucial to consumer purchasing decisions. Small shops selling electrical appliances are common in Africa. Source, interviewee. Su Ran recalled the hardships of starting a business. He once traveled to almost all countries in West Africa. I started from scratch back then, and finally the annual sales in a country in Côte d'Ivoire reached around 30 to 40 million yuan. Opening channels is hard work. You need to travel everywhere to attract customers from various African countries. He personally experienced the difficult brand development in Africa, which also provided him with many new ideas for acquiring customers when he later founded his own brand. In 2019, Su Ran founded his own brand Muoc in Africa. Sell televisions to Africa. Source, interviewee. The brand was born in Shenzhen, China, and relies on domestic R&D and supply chains, but its main markets are Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and other places in Africa. At the same time, they also formed a joint venture with another domestic panel company to establish a factory in Ghana, Africa, to achieve mass production. Regarding the current situation, Su Ran believes, we used to copy domestic successful experiences when going overseas, but now we are more professional when going overseas, and domestic competition is so fierce. In addition, many large companies have investment support for going overseas in the internet. It's as simple as selling something. His building a local factory is just one step in deep localization. A large number of local layouts on the channel side are the root cause of the local concerns about the after-sales warranty of home appliances. Local people are afraid of being deceived by products without after-sales service. But we have more than 1,000 offline stores, control channels, and terminals, have physical stores, and are large in scale. Local people will feel more reliable. So Suran's company has integrated a large number of offline stores in Africa, all with dark blue move signs. In fact, the sales of home appliances in many places in Africa are still small stores in the local mom-and-pop shop style. The stores of more than 10 square meters are filled with chores and merchandise, and there are no rich displays. Mood's newly opened store in the city center is spacious and modern. There are more than a dozen TVs in our store, playing Transformers together. When the locals came in, they all called it amazing. Marketing activity for new store openings in Africa. Source, interviewee. Local business costs such as labor and land rent in Africa are very cheap. Even in very urban areas, the land rent for a 30 to 50 square meter commercial store is only equivalent to more than 1,000 UN, making cost control relatively easy. And local consumers are very receptive to new things and often have the idea of being very curious and want to give it a try. These situations are very friendly for going overseas. Mao Willing, who opened an accounting firm in Africa to serve Chinese-funded enterprises, told us from another perspective the development of Africa and the changes in the environment for Chinese people to go overseas in Africa. Doing business in Africa now requires more and more compliance. Mao Willing said, the biggest change over the years is taxation. Local taxation is quite strict, and everyone is nervous about tax issues. Although many markets in Africa are still blue oceans, the internet has not yet been widely spread there, and locals still buy newspapers for less than $0.5 each to obtain the latest information. However, with the development of the local area and the improvement of the business environment, the compliance requirements and professionalism requirements for going overseas in Africa will also become higher and higher. It is no longer a land of completely barbaric growth. Overlooking the center of Nairobi. Source, interviewee. How to avoid pitfalls amid cultural differences. The increasingly improving business environment in Africa is not a bad thing for many overseas entrepreneurs who want to take root and thrive in Africa. Because the other side of low cost must be insufficient supporting facilities. Entrepreneurs need to bear both the advantages and disadvantages of developing a business in Africa's big blue ocean. For example, the issue of delivery can stump many African overseas merchants. The last mile is an urgent need for many businesses. A few years ago, Ghana's local postal service, Ghana Post, was extremely inefficient. At the beginning, businesses could only find some small fleets to help with delivery. However, the cooperation of these small fleets was unstable and the service it is also very worrying, and even if something happens halfway, if the screen is broken, we will not compensate you. At the beginning, there was no modern logistics and distribution industry in the local area, so as merchants and brands expanded, they needed to buy their own trucks to build a fleet. After 2019, after SpeedAdapt, also a Chinese-funded overseas enterprise, started localized operations of logistics in Africa, the situation became much better. When SUDAPI was first founded, ZTO Express was still its original shareholder. SpeedAdapt services in Africa are very good and relatively standardized. There will be many offline customers for logistics services, especially local wholesalers in Africa. A local entrepreneur told Zite1 News. Source, SpeedAdapt official website. And misunderstandings caused by huge cultural differences abound. For example, a Chinese shop owner opened a new store in Africa. In his imagination, the opening celebration should be decorated with big red flowers and red silk, but the local store responsible for the opening decoration actually sent a piece of white cloth with white flowers framed on it. It makes people dumbfounded, and even a little angry. The locals explained to him, this is the difference between Chinese culture and African culture. In Chinese culture, red represents happiness, while in the cultures of some African countries, red represents danger, which is more taboo in our culture. White here represents joy. In the end, he decided to use neither white nor red, but blue flowers for decoration, so that the cultural differences between the two sides could be smoothed out. The old overseas Chinese who have been in Africa for many years have already figured out the way of seeking common ground while reserving differences to deal with the differences with the local culture. African local stall. Source, interviewee. Similar cultural differences, Al-Hiraze, who was dispatched to Africa by a major factory, also had deep feelings about local life. On the one hand, the working environment here is really not that busy, but on the other hand, people here are really too casual about time. Local employees still hope to have their own rest time, and even if they make less money, they still want to live a leisurely life. If local employees are required to work overtime on holidays or at night, then overtime pay is essential, but the most common situation is that many people would rather not receive overtime pay and choose leisure work. Under this concept of life, the accuracy of time is more like an interval concept to them. For example, if you have an appointment at 4 p.m., it is very likely that it will be already evening when your friend arrives, even if it is a business appointment. Their lack of guilt and even taking it for granted makes the Chinese people who come here feel amazed and shocked. The attitude of local people towards work has also obviously affected the local recruitment and expansion of Chinese people in the process of localization. Take our factory as an example. The average salary of workers is about 2,000 yuan in RMB. A business owner who has his own factory in Africa told Xinhua News. The income range of around 200 to 300 US dollars is a very common monthly income level for ordinary local workers. For local people as corporate executives, including commissions, subsidies, and paid benefits, the income level is much higher than that of ordinary workers. Local employees hand out flyers. Source, interviewee. Most of the domestic and foreign employees sent to the local area are engaged in technical guidance work. Nearly 90% of them are technical positions, and there are very few people in this group, no more than 20 people. With such a high proportion of local employees in the company, it is difficult not to be affected by local working habits in Africa. Therefore, many Chinese bosses who have experienced employee recruitment in Africa have a lot of memories of the weird behaviors of local employees. Even if he is given overtime pay on weekends, he may have to go to church before coming to work. When recruiting workers, everyone pays more attention to play and rest time, and even salary is not the first priority. I often have employees come to me asking for a salary increase. If they are rejected, they accept it calmly and then come back to ask for it the next day. He asks for leave every now and then, saying he has something to do at home, and always runs home. It always makes you feel that he is not at ease. These are all problems that managers may encounter when recruiting employees on the African continent, but have never faced them in China. However, after a long period of exploration, the company has also formed a set of management plans that are effective in the local area. If you want to restrain local employees, you must adapt to their culture. Su Ran said. More and more African bosses going overseas are changing their original domestic beating chicken blood entrepreneurial approach and adapting to the local African approach of reducing efficiency, but not reducing benefits, under the same sales output, although the work efficiency of a single person is not high, but because the labor cost is not high, the actual profit ratio is not much different in the end. If an employee really performs poorly at work, fails to meet expectations, or makes a major mistake, the boss can write a warning letter to him or her, and the other person will be greatly shocked. If the other party still does not change after 3 warning letters are issued, it will fully comply with the legal requirements for him to resign. Su Ran said. I don't feel anxious here. I am not anxious about life in Africa. Du Rui told Xinhua News. The locals always say, life is too short. With the average lifespan in Africa being limited, they may feel more about the impermanence of life. When life is out of control, put it aside. There's really no point in devoting all your time to work. The vast savanna of East Africa. Source, interviewee. After many years in Africa, many people who go to sea have become calm due to the natural peace of the local residents. After the epidemic in 2020, many Africans who went overseas decided to return home. Du Rui, who returned to China with his young daughter, is one of them. On the one hand, I am considering the risk of the local epidemic, and on the other hand, I also want to give my young daughter more exposure to Chinese education. But she still feels that Africa is a place she wants to go back to. I obviously feel that the situation is different. Du Rui said, in Africa, you will feel that life is very simple, and your desire for material things and gain and loss will be weakened. Zimbabwe, where she once lived for a long time, is a country with relatively optimistic development. The education level of the local people is also at a relatively high level among African countries, and the illiteracy rate is almost the lowest in Africa. She has also participated in many cultural activities in the local area, and has also worn ethnic clothing brands developed by local Africans. This type of ethnic clothing is like our tan suit or hanfu, and it also represents the culture and pride of the local people. Participate in cultural exchanges and interactions in Africa. Source, interviewee. For her, Africa is an idyllic place where interpersonal relationships are relatively simple and work and life are clearly separated. In fact, the entire African territory is very vast. The Africa we usually talk about is not the full picture of Africa that people who go abroad have really touched. It would be very rough to only regard Africa as a whole and lump it together. North Africa has a higher level of industrialization and higher per capita income, and is even closer to the situation in Europe overall. Africa south of the Sahara Desert is divided into east and west, and the overall economic level is relatively weak. As the map extends to South Africa, the level of industrialization and infrastructure construction is much higher, and some areas look very modern. There are also beautiful shopping malls in some African countries, and online shopping and other operations that are familiar to the country can be fully implemented locally. For example, the mobile payment EcoCash is used locally, and local agricultural products also have integrated e-commerce promotion and sales channels on Facebook. Although the local area does not have QR codes everywhere like in China, if the other party needs to make a payment and shows his or her phone number, mobile payment can complete the payment in one-to-one correspondence with a separate phone number, which is also very convenient. Local shopping malls and streets in Africa. Source, interviewee. Kenya in East Africa was Suran's first stop when he came to Africa, and it was also the bridgehead for many Chinese people to go to Africa. On the border between Kenya and Tanzania is the famous Masai Mara Savannah. There are antelopes, lions, and zebras all over the place. Under the afterglow of the setting sun, the great migration of animals in the wilderness is particularly shocking. When we come to the beach in Mombasa, also located in Kenya, the white sand and sea water illustrate another side of the African natural landscape. Africa's pristine natural landscape. Source, interviewee. Recalling his past experience of skydiving at Diani Beach, he laughed and talked about how he jumped from an altitude of 3,000 meters. The amazing natural scenery and extraordinary sea career were all rare and precious experiences in life. It is such a continent with extremely pristine natural scenery, and it actually has more connections with us than we imagine. He felt that the people here were very simple. Once his car got stuck in the mud on the road, and people around him would spontaneously run over to help him push the car out of the pit. In the first year, I didn't adapt to Africa and wanted to go home. In the second year, I adapted to Africa and thought it would be good to take it slow. In the third and fourth years, after returning to China, I suddenly missed Africa very much. Suran said. From misunderstanding to respect to appreciation and recognition, this is the magic of the African continent. When more and more overseas Chinese come here, they will understand more with deeper contact. Only when people have seen a bigger world, the scale of measuring people and things will become broader.